The year was 1879, and the wind was a hungry thing. It scoured the high plains of Texas, scraping across fields of fireweed until their magenta heads bowed in surrender. It was a wind that carried no promise of rain, only the grit of the earth itself. Along the San Gabriel Road, a ribbon of churned soil bleeding into the landscape, the red dust moved not in clouds, but as a single, creeping entity. It coated the sagebrush, filled the cracks in the sun-baked ground, and clung to the very air you breathed, a fine powder that settled on your tongue and in the deepest corners of your soul. This was a land that demanded patience and punished hope. Cole Thorne felt the grit between his teeth as he led his bay gelding, Atlas, across the worn planks of the wooden bridge that marked the entry to the town of Redemption. The timbers groaned under the horse's weight, a sound like an old man settling his bones. Cole's own bones felt old. He walked with a steady, unhurried pace that spoke of a man who measured his life not in days, but in seasons of drought and hardship. His shoulders were broad under a faded chambray shirt, the muscles honed by the repetitive labor of ranching. His face, weathered by a sun that knew no mercy, was a map of quiet endurance. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, missed nothing but revealed little. In Redemption, they had a name for him. They said he was cold as canyon stone. They said it in hushed tones at the general store, over lukewarm beer in the saloon, and in the pews of the stark wooden church on Sundays. The talk had started after Martha died. The smallpox had swept through the territory 2 winters back, a merciless reaping that had stolen his wife and left a silence in their small ranch house in Arroyo Blanco that was louder than any storm. Cole hadn't wept, not where anyone could see. He had simply dug the grave himself, chiseled her name into a flat river stone, and returned to his cattle, his fences, his solitude. The grief was a private thing, a cold stone he carried in his gut, and he had no intention of sharing its weight. The town mistook his silence for coldness, his steadfastness for a lack of feeling. He let them. Words were a currency he had little use for. The town of Redemption was little more than a single dusty street flanked by false-fronted buildings that leaned on each other for support. There was the saloon, the bank, the assayer's office, and the newly combined mercantile and post office. It was toward this last building that a woman, new to the unforgiving glare of the Texas sun, was struggling. Eliza Hart had arrived 2 weeks prior on the morning stagecoach, a solitary figure with 2 large trunks and a gaze that held a quiet, defiant determination. She had come to take over the small seamstress shop left vacant by old Mrs. Gable, and, with the town council's blessing, to act as the custodian for the town's small collection of books, which were housed in a dusty room at the back of the shop. She was the town's new seamstress and librarian, a combination that struck most folks as odd but necessary. At this moment, she was wrestling with a heavy wooden crate filled with bolts of wool and calico, a recent delivery from the freight wagon. Her brow was beaded with perspiration, her dark hair coming loose from the neat bun at the nape of her neck. She hoisted the crate, its rough edges digging into her forearms, and took a determined step up onto the boardwalk. Her boot heel caught on a warped plank. For a heart-stopping second, she was suspended in an awkward dance with gravity, her arms flailing, the crate tilting precariously. Cole was 10 feet away when he saw her stumble. He moved without thinking, his long strides closing the distance in an instant. The crate tumbled from her grasp, and he reached out, not for her, but for the falling box. His hands, calloused and hard, enveloped the splintery wood, his body absorbing the momentum of the fall. He grunted with the effort, his knuckles scraping hard against a bolt of coarse brown wool. A thin line of red welled up on his skin. He set the crate down on the boardwalk with a solid thud. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. Eliza had found her balance, her hand pressed to her chest where her heart was hammering against her ribs. "Oh, thank you. I didn't see that board." Her voice was breathless, but clear, without the fluttery panic some women might have shown. She looked at the crate, Then at him, her eyes, the color of moss after a rain, traveled from his steadying hands to the raw scrape on his knuckles. "You're hurt," she said, her concern immediate and genuine. Cole glanced at his hand as if just noticing the injury, then curled his fingers into a fist, hiding the blood. "It's nothing." Their eyes met. It was a moment that lasted no longer than a single, drawn-out breath, but it was enough. In his, she saw a weariness that went bone-deep, a profound and unshakable loneliness that he wore like a second skin. But beneath it, she saw a flicker of something else, a solidness, a strength as undeniable as the bedrock beneath the thin soil. In her eyes, he saw not the fragility he expected, but a resilience that surprised him. He saw the faint smudges of dust on her cheek, the fierce intelligence in her gaze, and the fatigue of a woman trying to carve out a place for herself in a world not built for her. The connection was brief, unspoken, but as clear as the ringing of a blacksmith's hammer. He gave a curt nod, a gesture that was both an acknowledgement and a dismissal. He turned to his horse, his back straight, the invisible wall of his solitude rising around him once more. Eliza watched him go, a strange feeling settling in her chest. She looked down at the crate of fabric, her livelihood, safe and sound on the boardwalk. Then she looked at the faint smear of his blood on the rough brown wool, from the cool, shadowed interior of the Redemption Saloon. Another pair of eyes had witnessed the entire exchange. Jasper Crow, the owner of the town's only bank, sat at his usual table by the window, a glass of whiskey untouched before him. He was a man whose softness was deceptive. His hands were smooth, his suit tailored, his face clean-shaven, but his eyes were small and sharp, missing nothing, calculating everything. He had seen the rancher's swift, reflexive action and the woman's reaction. He saw the flicker of connection that passed between them, and a smile, thin and predatory, touched his lips. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, the smile never leaving his face. People were like ledgers to Jasper Crow. You just had to know how to read them to find their debts and their assets. Cole Thorne was a stubborn debt. This new woman, however, might just prove to be an unexpected asset. His gaze drifted from the window to a notice tacked crookedly on the saloon's wall. The paper was already yellowing, the ink stark and black. It was a simple announcement, but to the men and women of Redemption, it was a threat. Notice the North Silver Railroad, in accordance with territorial expansion grants, requests temporary water concessions from the San Gabriel watershed for the duration of the dry season to facilitate continued track construction. Water concessions. The words were a polite mask for a thirsty grab. The railroad was coming, a snake of iron and steam pushing its way west, and it needed water for its engines, water for its work crews. It was water the ranchers and farmers of Redemption needed for their own survival. The San Gabriel was already running low, the lifeblood of the valley thinning to a trickle. To concede any of it felt like slitting your own throat to quench another man's thirst. Just then, a sound peeled through the hot, still air, cutting through the low murmur of the saloon and the clop of horses on the street. It was the tolling of the church bell, a deep, resonant bong that marked the passing of another hour. The vibration traveled through the wooden buildings, and from the corrugated tin roof of the livery stable, a fine shower of red dust shook loose, drifting down like a sorrowful veil. Outside on the street, Cole Thorne stopped. He had been about to untie Atlas's reins from the hitching post, but the sound of the bell rooted him to the spot. It was the same bell that had rung on his wedding day, the same bell that had tolled for Martha's passing. It was a sound that held his entire life within its metallic cry. He looked up, not at the church steeple, but at the vast, empty expanse of the sky. The sun was a white-hot coin in a sea of pale blue. There were no clouds. There was never any damned clouds. The weight in his heart, the cold stone of his grief, felt heavier now, joined by the new weight of a coming fight he did not want but knew he could not avoid. The railroad, the drought. Jasper Crow's watchful eyes, it was all part of the same relentless pressure. He turned his face away from the street, away from the mercantile where the new woman was now dragging her crate inside, and looked back down the road toward Arroyo Blanco, toward the silence of his empty home. A gust of wind, stronger and more insistent than before, swept down the street. It kicked up a whirlwind of dust and debris, rattling the signs and slamming a loose shutter against a wall with a sharp crack. It was a wind that carried the chill of the high desert, a harbinger of the lean, hard days that were coming. It was a wind that promised nothing but a struggle. The air inside the Redemption Bank was cool and still, smelling of old paper, oiled leather, and the faint, metallic scent of money. It was a smell that clung to Jasper Crow like a second skin. He sat behind a large desk of polished mahogany, a dark island in the dim room, and pushed a sheaf of papers toward Cole Thorne. The soft scratch of the paper sliding across the wood was the only sound. "It's a standard renegotiation." "Cole," Jasper said, his voice smooth as river stone. "A formality, given the circumstances." He steepled his clean, manicured fingers, a picture of calm reason. The bank must protect its investments, especially in trying times. Cole stood before the desk. He did not take the offered chair. He felt out of place in the cool, dark room, his dusty boots a violation on the polished floorboards. His gaze was fixed on the document, his eyes scanning the neat, spidery script. He had learned to read from Martha, his lips moving silently over the words as she had taught him. But he read legal documents with the same caution a man uses to cross a patch of ground known for rattlesnakes. His eyes stopped on a new line item, a piece of clerk's artistry tucked between the principal and the interest. "Drought fee." Cole's voice was flat, containing the word as if it were a foul taste. Jasper gave a small, sympathetic sigh. "An unfortunate necessity. The lack of rain puts a strain on all assets. The land, the cattle, their value becomes speculative. The fee is a small measure of insurance for the bank's continued support. It's a tax on having no luck." Cole stated. It wasn't a question. "You could see it that way," Jasper allowed, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "I see it as a shared burden. We are all in this together. After all, the railroad's arrival will bring prosperity, new opportunities. We simply have to weather this season. A signature is all that's required to secure your note through the winter." Cole's jaw tightened. He could feel the trap, its steel jaws hidden beneath the soft language of shared burdens and future prosperity. The land was his life, the debt a chain he'd inherited and worked every day to break. This new fee was just another link forged in the banker's cool office. His hand, thick with calluses, hovered over the pen Jasper offered. For a long moment, he said nothing. The silence stretched, heavy with the weight of sun-cracked earth and thirsty cattle. Finally, he took the pen. His signature was a sharp, angry scrawl, the ink bleeding slightly on the crisp paper. He slid the document back across the desk and turned, walking out of the bank without another word, leaving the cool darkness for the blinding, unforgiving sun. Across the street, in the small shop that now served as Redemption's seamstressy and library, the light was different. It streamed through the large front window, illuminating the fine dust motes that danced in the air. The room smelled of fresh linen, beeswax, and the faint, earthy scent of the books lining the shelves at the back. Eliza Hart sat on a stool, her head bent over her work. Her needle moved with a swift, practiced rhythm, a tiny silver fish darting through a sea of dark wool. She was mending a tear in a heavy shooting jacket, the fabric frayed near the shoulder where a rider might have caught it on a low-hanging branch. The bell above the door jingled, and two women from the town entered, their conversation halting as they saw Eliza at her work. They were Mrs. Albright, the portly wife of the blacksmith, and the younger, more nervous Mrs. Gable, whose late mother-in-law had been the shop's previous owner. "Good morning, Miss Hart." "Mrs." Albright said, her voice carrying the weight of town authority. "Good morning, ladies," Eliza replied, offering a small, polite smile without pausing her stitching. "What can I do for you today?" "Just picking up the trim for my Sunday dress." "Mrs." Albright announced, moving toward the counter. Mrs. Gable lingered by a bolt of calico, her fingers tracing the printed flowers. As Eliza rose to measure out the lace trim, the women's voices dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, a sound as dry and rustling as leaves. "Heard it from my Henry," Mrs. Albright murmured, her back to Eliza. "He was shoeing the horse for that railroad foreman. Said they're not just asking for water, they're planning to dam the creek, just north of Thorne's property." Mrs. Gable gasped softly. "Dam the creek? But that's the main artery for the whole valley. The downstream ranches will dry up completely." "Exactly," Mrs. Albright hissed. "They want to build a water wheel. Need the consistent pressure to power their saws and drills for the trestle bridge. They don't care a whit about our cattle or our crops. To them, our water is just an inconvenience." Eliza stood perfectly still. The delicate lace pooled in her hands. She kept her eyes on her task, her movements measured and calm, but her ears strained to catch every word. She had seen the notice in the saloon. She had felt the tension in the air, a low hum of anxiety that ran beneath the daily life of the town. Now, it had a name: a dam, a water wheel, a deliberate stoppage of the valley's lifeblood. She finished cutting the lace and wrapped it neatly in brown paper. As she handed the package to Mrs. Albright, she asked a question, her voice carefully neutral. "Pardon me for asking, but do you know when the next freight delivery with wool from the east is expected? The price seems to climb with every week of this dry spell." The question successfully diverted them. The conversation shifted to the outrageous costs of goods and the unreliability of the freight lines, the larger danger of the dam momentarily forgotten in the face of more immediate, domestic concerns. After the women left, the bell jingling their departure, Eliza returned to her stool. She picked up the heavy jacket again, but her fingers were still. She looked at the jagged tear in the wool, a small wound in the fabric. Outside, the sun beat down on the dusty street, and she felt a chill, as if the shadow of a great vulture had just passed over the town, miles away, under that same relentless sun. Cole Thorne worked. The rhythmic thud of his hammer echoed in the dry air of Arroyo Blanco. He was building a new drinking trough, a long one, cobbled together from salvaged planks and sealed with pine tar. His old one had sprung a leak he couldn't fix, and not a single drop of water could be wasted. His shirt was soaked with sweat, sticking to his back in a dark patch. The muscles in his arms and shoulders bunched and released with each swing of the hammer. He worked with a grim, focused intensity. When the trough was finished, he began the long, back-breaking task of filling it. He carried the water in 2 large wooden buckets from his well, the one Martha had always said gave the sweetest water in the territory. Each step from the well to the trough was a careful, balanced negotiation with the parched ground. He poured the water into the trough with a reverence usually reserved for a baptism. The sound of it splashing against the wood was a miracle. He watched his small herd of cattle approach, their movements slow and weary. They drank deeply, their long, rough tongues lapping at the precious liquid. Cole stood back, leaning against a fence post, and counted each bucket he drew as if he were counting out gold coins. This was his world. Not the cool dark bank or the murmuring town, but this: the heat, the thirst, the relentless work, and the silent, desperate prayer for rain. A few days later, Eliza Hart rode out to Arroyo Blanco. She had rented a gentle mare from the livery, and the journey had left a fine coating of red dust on her riding skirt. Tucked into her saddlebag was a neatly wrapped parcel. As she approached the ranch, she saw Cole near the barn, mending a piece of tack. He looked up at the sound of her horse, his expression unreadable, his hand resting on the hilt of the knife he was using. She dismounted and tied the mare to the hitching post near the low-roofed porch. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice steady. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." He just watched her, his silence a wall. "The jacket is mended," she said, holding out the parcel. "And I believe this is yours. It must have fallen from your pocket the other day, in town." She held out a simple, folded cotton handkerchief. It was clean, freshly pressed. He took the parcel and the handkerchief, his rough fingers brushing against hers for a fraction of a second. He didn't look at the jacket. He just tucked the handkerchief into his pocket. "What do I owe you?" "Nothing," she said quickly. "Consider it a thank you for the crate." An understanding passed between them. A debt paid. They stood there on the hard-packed earth in front of his house. The silence stretched, but it was different from the silence in the bank. This one was filled with the sounds of the ranch, the lowing of a distant cow, the buzz of insects in the heat, the creak of a weather vane on the barn roof. The air smelled of dry straw and the faint, tangy scent of wet leather from the tack he was mending. It was a long silence. Not uncomfortable, but charged with all the things they weren't saying. Eliza's gaze drifted past him, toward the large double doors of the barn. There, drawn in what looked like charcoal on the weathered wood, was a crude map. It was a network of lines, some thick, some thin, showing the twists and turns of a waterway. She could see where smaller tributaries fed into a main channel. There were marks and notes scrawled beside certain points, and near one of the bends, a smudge that could only have been made by the heel of a calloused hand, pressing hard to make a point. It was a map of the creek, his creek, a testament to his intimate knowledge of every rock and eddy. It was a battle plan, drawn in secret. The sound of an approaching buggy broke the stillness. Both of them turned to see Jasper Crow pulling up, his horse kicking up a cloud of dust that settled on his fine black coat. He tipped his hat to Eliza, a gesture of polished courtesy that felt entirely out of place. "Miss Hart," he said, his smile bright. "A pleasure to see you out enjoying the country air." He then turned his attention to Cole, his expression shifting to one of business. "Cole, I was just on my way back from the Miller place and thought I'd save you a trip to town." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. It looked distressingly similar to the one Cole had signed at the bank. "This is just a formality," Jasper said, the same words he'd used before. "A water consensus agreement. The railroad wants to show the territorial government that they have the community's support for their infrastructure improvements. A sign of progress for redemption. We're just asking all the landowners along the creek to sign." He held the paper out to Cole. Cole looked from the paper to Jasper's expectant face, and then his gaze flickered for a moment to the map on his barn door. He did not take the paper. "I'm not signing," Cole said. Jasper's smile tightened at the edges. "Now, Cole, let's be reasonable. This is for the good of the whole town. A little cooperation now will pay dividends later," I said, Cole repeated, his voice low and hard as granite. "I'm not signing." The two men locked eyes. A silent battle of wills waged in the dusty ranch yard. Jasper was the first to look away. He folded the paper with a sharp snap and placed it back in his coat. "As you wish," he said, his voice clipped. "But stubbornness has a high price in a drought." He tipped his hat again, climbed back into his buggy, and drove off, leaving a trail of angry dust behind him. The tension remained, thick in the air. Cole stood watching the buggy disappear, his shoulders rigid. Eliza looked at his hands, clenched into tight fists at his sides. She thought of the tear in the heavy jacket, and the patient, strong stitches she had used to close it. She took a small step closer. Her voice was quiet, barely more than a murmur, but it cut through the heavy silence. "Mr. Thorne," she said slowly, "if you find you have need of a needle and thread, I have them." He turned his head, his gaze meeting hers. He understood. She wasn't just talking about mending clothes. She was offering something more, a needle to stitch a defense, a thread of alliance. He looked at her for a long moment, at the quiet strength in her moss-green eyes. A flicker of something shifted in his expression, a silent acknowledgement of her meaning. He gave a single, sharp nod. He did not smile, but for the first time in a long time, the cold stone in his gut felt just a little less heavy. Night fell on Arroyo Blanco not as a blanket, but as a predator. The vast, bruised sky offered no comfort, only a sliver of moon that cast long, distorted shadows and made the familiar landscape seem strange and menacing. The heat of the day bled slowly from the ground, but the air grew cold with a wind that whispered through the dry grass with a sound like sighing ghosts. Sleep was a distant country Cole Thorne had no passport for. He lay on his thin mattress, his hands laced behind his head, and listened. He listened to the house settle, to the rustle of some small creature in the eaves, and to the profound, aching silence left behind by Martha. Then he heard it, a sound that did not belong. It was a clatter from the direction of the creek, not the organic sound of a deer dislodging a stone, but the sharper, more deliberate clink of metal on rock, followed by a muffled thud. It was a sound of work being done in secret. He was out of bed in an instant, moving with the fluid silence of a man who had spent his life walking on brittle ground. He didn't light a lamp. His eyes, long accustomed to the dark, were all he needed. He pulled on his boots, his worn denim trousers, and slipped from the house, the night air a cold shock against his skin. He didn't take a rifle, not yet. First, he would see. He moved along the fence line, a shadow among shadows, his boots making no sound on the packed earth. The creek was a pale, shimmering ribbon under the sliver of moon, the water so low he could see the smooth, pale stones of its bed. For weeks, he had been coming out here at dusk, moving rocks, building small, temporary diversions to channel what little water remained into a deeper, slower-moving pool from which he could draw for his cattle. It was a constant, losing battle against the sun. He saw the source of the noise. Two figures, their backs to him, were working at the bend just above his property line. One was driving something into the creek bed with a small sledgehammer. The other was holding it steady. The clink and thud he had heard. They were trespassers, their purpose cloaked in darkness. Cole flattened himself behind a cluster of mesquite, his breath coming low and steady, his heart a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. He watched as they finished their work, exchanged a few low words he couldn't catch, and then scrambled up the far bank, disappearing into the darkness. Cole waited. He counted to 100, his eyes scanning the opposite bank, his ears straining against the whisper of the wind. When he was certain they were gone, he moved. He waded into the shallow, frigid water, the cold biting at his ankles. He made his way to the spot where the men had been working. His hand went under the water, his fingers searching the rocky bottom. They brushed against smooth, worn river stones, and then something else. It was wood, smooth, milled wood, driven deep into the creek bed. His fingers traced its length until they found the top. It was cut flat, an engineer's stake. He worked his fingers around it, his muscles straining as he began to rock it back and forth, loosening it from the grip of the mud and stone. With a final, grunting heave, it came free. He lifted it from the water. Even in the faint moonlight, he could see the color painted on its top. Red, the color of the North Silver Railroad. A coldness that had nothing to do with the creek water spread through his chest. This was not a casual act of mischief. This was a survey, a claim. They were marking the spot for their dam, laying claim to his water under the cover of night. He stood there for a long time, the stake heavy in his hand, the cold water swirling around his boots. He felt the violation of it deep in his bones. This land, this water, was all he had left. It was the only thing he had been able to keep safe. His walk back to the house was different. His senses were on fire. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every rustle of the wind sounded like a footstep. His eyes scanned the dark shapes of his barn, his corral, his small, solitary house. It was then that he smelled it, a sharp, chemical odor that cut through the clean, dry scent of the night, turpentine and oil. It was the smell of fire. He followed the scent, his steps now urgent. It led him not to the house, but toward the barn, where his winter supply of hay was stacked, dry as tinder, tucked beneath a sprawling, thorny yucca plant. Just a few yards from the barn wall was a small, dark bundle. He knelt, his fingers probing the rough object. It was a tightly wadded ball of rags, soaked in something greasy and flammable. A fire starter. It had been placed with careful, malicious intent, hidden where a single spark, a carelessly tossed match, could turn his entire livelihood into a pillar of flame against the night sky. He picked up the oily bundle, the foul-smelling liquid coating his fingers. He carried it to the water trough and submerged it, holding it under until he was sure any chance of it catching a spark was gone. He stood there, the water dripping from his hands, and looked from the darkened barn to the red stake he had thrown down by the porch steps. The pieces clicked into place with the chilling finality of a jail door shutting. Jasper's drought fee, the water consensus he had refused to sign, and now this was not a request. It was a threat, delivered in the language of cowards and arsonists. A bitter taste, acrid as alkali dust, filled his mouth. He looked up at the cold, indifferent stars. "It's not just the drought," he whispered into the darkness, the words torn from him. "It's men. In redemption." The same moon cast a pale light through the front window of Eliza Hart's shop. She was working late, the soft glow of her kerosene lamp a small beacon of light on the dark street. The books were put away. The day's sewing was done, but she sat at her small writing desk, a pen in her hand. She was trying to compose a letter to her sister back east, a letter that would describe the endless sky and the stark beauty of the land without mentioning the deep, abiding loneliness that seemed to seep from the very soil. She was startled by a sound from the boardwalk outside, a scuff of a boot, furtive and quick, followed by the faint creak of a floorboard near her side alley. It was too late for any respectable citizen to be out. Curiosity mixed with a prickle of unease. She rose and moved to the edge of the window, peering out into the shadowed street. She saw a figure moving away from her shop, heading toward the saloon at the far end of the street. He was walking quickly, his shoulders hunched, keeping to the deepest shadows cast by the building overhangs. She couldn't see his face, but as he passed through a patch of faint moonlight, something caught her eye. It was a glint of metal. He was wearing a dark vest, and down the front of it was a row of what looked like silver concho buttons, each one catching the faint light for a split second before being swallowed by the darkness again. The detail lodged itself in her mind. It was distinctive, something to remember. She watched until he disappeared into the swinging doors of the saloon. Then she returned to her desk. Her desire to write to her sister had vanished, replaced by a sense of disquiet. The whispering women, the talk of a dam, and now this furtive figure in the night. It felt like the air before a storm, charged and heavy. She pushed aside the letter to her sister and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. She dipped her pen in the inkwell, her movements slow and deliberate. "Reverend Michael," she began. He was the town's preacher, a man whose moral compass seemed, for the most part, to point true. She paused, chewing the end of her pen, choosing her words with the same care she used to select a thread. She wrote of her concerns, of the whispers, of the railroad's notice, of the palpable fear she felt growing in the town like a bitter weed. She did not mention the man with the silver buttons. It was a suspicion, not a fact, and she dealt in facts. She finished with a sentence that felt as true and solid as anything she had ever written. "It seems to me," she wrote, "that in a land as dry as this, justice begins with water." She read the letter over, then carefully folded it. She did not put it in an envelope. It was not ready to be sent. It was a record, a testament, a private declaration of where she stood. She slipped it into the back of a thick volume of Shakespeare, a place no one in Redemption was likely to look, inside the Redemption Saloon. The air was thick with the smells of stale beer, cheap whiskey, and unwashed men. At his usual table, Jasper Crow raised his glass. Across from him sat a broad, hard-faced man with eyes like chips of flint. This was Mr. Corrigan, the foreman for the North Silver Railroad's construction crew. His hands, which rested on the table, were large and capable, the hands of a man who broke things for a living. His vest was unbuttoned, revealing a row of tarnished silver buttons. To progress, Mr. Corrigan, Jasper said, his voice a smooth counterpoint to the saloon's rough atmosphere. Corrigan grunted and lifted his own glass. To the dam, he said, his voice like gravel. We'll break ground at dawn, day after tomorrow. My men are ready. He drained his glass and slammed it down on the table. Thorn won't be a problem. See that he isn't, Jasper said, taking a delicate sip of his own whiskey. A fire, a spooked herd. Accidents happen all the time in a drought. It would be a tragedy. The smile on his face was a bloodless slash. Back at Arroyo Blanco, the cold wind found its way through the chinks in the cabin walls. Cole lay in his bed, the red stake leaning against the wall where he could see it. He wasn't even trying to sleep now. He was a sentinel, his body rigid, his ears tuned to the sounds of the night. He listened to the wind, to the groaning of the old wood of his house, and beneath it all, he could hear, or perhaps feel, another sound. It was the slow, steady, rhythmic beat of his cattle's hearts, the sound of their soft breathing coming from the corral just beyond his window. It was the sound of life, the fragile, vulnerable life that depended entirely on him, on the water in his creek, and on his ability to stand against the coming tide. And then, another sound came, carried on the cold night wind. It was faint at first, a low, deep rumble from far to the east. It grew steadily, a rhythmic chugging, a sound that was utterly alien to the natural world. It was the sound of a steam engine, a test to the machinery that was crawling its way across the plains. It was the sound of the future, a future that wanted to drink his creek dry and turn his land to dust. It did not sound like progress. It sounded like a great, hungry beast, rousing itself from sleep and growling in the dark. The sun was high and brutal the next afternoon when Eliza rode out to Arroyo Blanco again. The heat shimmered in waves above the baked earth, distorting the horizon until the distant mesas seemed to tremble. She carried a heavy tin canteen, the water sloshing with each step of her horse. It was a small offering, a gesture that felt both inadequate and essential. In this thirsty land, water was a prayer, a currency of hope. She found Cole by the corral, wrestling with a length of barbed wire. The wicked metal had snagged and coiled, and he was trying to work it free from a fence post with a pair of heavy iron pliers. He moved with a frustrated economy of motion, his brow furrowed in concentration, his shirt stained dark with sweat down the center of his back. He didn't seem to notice her approach until her shadow fell over his work. He looked up, his eyes squinting against the glare. He saw her, then the canteen in her hand. He straightened up slowly, wiping a dusty forearm across his forehead. He didn't speak, but a question hung in his gaze. "I was boiling water for tea and thought you might be thirsty," she said, the lie simple and transparent. No one boiled water for tea in this heat unless they had to. She was offering him a share of her own carefully managed supply. He nodded, a curt, almost imperceptible movement of his head, and took the canteen she offered. Their fingers didn't touch this time, but the space between them felt charged, a palpable thing. He unstoppered it and drank, not with the desperate gulps of a man dying of thirst, but with a slow, measured respect for the gift. He drank half of it before stopping, screwing the cap back on with a decisive twist. He held it out for her. "You'll need the rest for your ride back." "I'm fine," she insisted. "Take it," he said. His voice was not unkind, but it was absolute. It was the voice of a man who did not accept debts he could not immediately repay. As she took the canteen, her eyes fell on his hand. A fresh line of blood, dark and sluggish, was welling from a deep gash across his knuckles. The barbed wire had won its small battle. A sharp point on the pliers had torn his skin open. "Your hand," she said, her voice soft. Cole glanced down at the injury as if it belonged to someone else. "It's a scratch. It needs to be cleaned," she countered, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Otherwise it will fester." She had seen enough infections on this frontier to know that a simple scratch could be a death sentence if neglected, without waiting for his permission. She hitched her horse and walked onto the small, shaded porch of his house, setting the canteen down on a dusty rail. She turned to face him, her expression expectant. He hesitated for a moment, a flicker of resistance in his eyes. He was not a man accustomed to being cared for, to accepting help. But then he seemed to look past her, at the silent, empty house behind her, and the resistance faded, replaced by a profound weariness. He walked onto the porch and held out his hand, palm up, a silent surrender. Eliza had come prepared. She had learned quickly that in this land, one had to be. From her small satchel, she produced a clean strip of white linen, a small bottle of carbolic acid diluted with water, and a tin of salve. She sat him down on the top step of the porch, the wood warm from the sun. She knelt before him on the dusty planks, taking his large, calloused hand into her own. Her touch was gentle, but firm and professional. She poured a small amount of the antiseptic solution onto the cloth, the sharp, clean smell cutting through the dusty air. As she began to clean the wound, he flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of the muscles in his arm. "I'm sorry," she murmured, her head bent low over her work. "It's fine." He grunted, his gaze fixed on the horizon, on the shimmer of heat over his parched fields. The silence settled between them again, but it was a different kind of silence than the one they had shared before. It was warmer, more intimate. It was the silence of a shared task, of a small act of care offered and accepted. The world seemed to shrink to the space on that porch, to the feeling of her small, soft fingers working carefully around his wound, to the scent of dust and antiseptic and the faint, clean smell of the linen. As she worked, her fingers tracing the network of older, faded scars that crisscrossed his hands and wrist, she saw one that was different. It was a pale, thin line on the inside of his wrist, not the ragged mark of an accident, but the clean scar of a deliberate cut, long since healed. It spoke of a pain deeper than any barbed wire could inflict. Her touch softened as she worked the salve into the new wound, her movements slow and rhythmic. The warmth of the porch, the quiet focus of the task. It all created a space for a question that had been sitting on her tongue since she'd heard the whispers in town, since she had seen the red stake. She finished wrapping the linen around his knuckles, tying it off with a neat, secure knot. But she didn't let go of his hand. She kept it resting in hers, her thumb gently stroking the back of his wrist, just above the old, pale scar. She kept her eyes on his hand, not his face. "You're not afraid of Jasper?" she asked. The question was a stone dropped into the quiet pool of the afternoon. It was direct, without artifice, stripped of all pleasantry. Cole didn't answer immediately. The seconds stretched out, measured by the steady beat of a woodpecker somewhere in the lone cottonwood tree by the well. He drew his gaze back from the horizon and looked down at their hands, at the startling contrast of her pale, slender fingers against his sun-darkened, scarred skin. He finally met her eyes. His were clear, the color of a winter sky, holding no secrets. "I am," he said. The admission was as plain and unadorned as the man himself. There was no shame in it, only truth. He let out a slow breath. "Fear's a part of living out here. You fear the drought, you fear the blight, you fear a horse with a broken leg. Jasper's just another kind of blight." He looked away again, toward the dry, cracked bed of the creek that bordered his property. "But letting other folks go thirsty, letting them get choked out by a man with a fancy suit and a pile of paper, that's a worse fear." His words hung in the hot, still air. It was the most he had ever said to her, perhaps the most he had said to anyone in years. It was a glimpse into the bedrock of his character, the simple, unshakable code he lived by. It was not about his own survival, but about a principle as essential and unyielding as the land itself, as if summoned by his words. The wind rose. It came suddenly, a violent, aggressive gust that tore across the plains. It howled around the corner of the house, slamming a loose shutter against the wall with a gunshot crack. It ripped at Eliza's skirt and whipped strands of loose hair across her face. The door behind them, which had been slightly ajar, was thrown open with a loud groan. Startled by the sudden violence of the wind and the noise, Eliza lost her footing on the edge of the step. She stumbled backward, a small cry escaping her lips. Cole moved with the same unthinking speed he'd shown with the falling crate. He hadn't let go of her hand. His grip tightened, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers, anchoring her. He didn't pull her forward. He simply held her, a solid, unmoving presence against the fury of the wind, keeping her from falling. The world stopped. The wind still howled. The shutter still banged. But all Eliza could feel was his hand. The shock of it went through her like a current. It was not a gentle hand. It was rough, the skin thick with calluses from years of holding reins and hammers and barbed wire. It was a hand that knew nothing of softness, but everything of strength, and it was enveloping hers completely, a feeling of absolute, unshakable security. She could feel the steady, powerful pulse in his wrist, a rhythm that was slow and strong and utterly at odds with the frantic beating of her own heart. She looked down at their joined hands, her smaller one almost lost in his. When she was steady, he did not let go. Neither of them moved. They stood on the porch, connected by that single point of contact, while the wind raged around them. Then, as one, they turned their heads and looked out, past the corral, past the fields of withered grass, to the dusty, empty bed of the creek. It was as if they were looking at the same thing, a shared vision of the fight to come. It was a hard and unforgiving view, offering no easy promises, only the certainty of a long, difficult struggle. But they were looking at it together. The wind began to die down, its fury spent, leaving behind a quivering silence. Eliza let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It was a soft, shaky sound. She looked from the dry creek back to their hands, still clasped together. A sense of resolve, as clear and bright as a drop of water, settled in her heart. She was afraid, of Jasper, of the railroad, of the coming conflict. But looking at the man beside her, feeling the solid strength of his hand, the fear seemed to find its proper place. It was no longer a paralyzing force, but a whetstone on which courage could be sharpened. She spoke, her voice barely a whisper against the sighing of the wind. "Then," she said, her gaze clear and unwavering as it met his, "we'll count every ladle of water together." Cole's grip tightened on her hand for just a second. A silent response, an acceptance of her vow, a pact sealed not with a signature on a piece of paper, but with a clasp of hands against a hard wind. He gave a single nod, his eyes never leaving hers. The long war for Arroyo Blanco had just gained a new soldier. The lamp in Eliza's shop burned late into the night, a solitary point of gold against the town's encroaching darkness. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving a heavy, expectant silence. Inside, the world had been reduced to the rough texture of a large square of burlap spread across the cutting table, the glint of a needle in Eliza's hand, and the low, careful murmur of Cole Thorne's voice. They were making a map, not with ink and paper, but with tools they understood. Cole's charcoal sketch on the barn door was a memory, a rough draft. This was to be the affidavit. Eliza had chosen the burlap for its resilience, its honest, earthy feel. For the water, she chose a thread of deep, vibrant blue, the color of a creek running full and healthy in a season no one could quite remember. Her needle moved with a quiet efficiency, following the path Cole described. He stood beside her, his large frame casting a long shadow in the lamplight. He didn't point to a drawing. He spoke from a knowledge etched into his very being. "It runs straight here," he'd say, his finger hovering over the blank canvas of the burlap. "Then it makes a sharp bend around a stand of old cottonwoods. The bank is soft on the north side." Eliza would listen, her eyes closed for a moment, picturing the lay of the land. Then she would begin to sew. Her stitches were small and tight, a line of blue lifeblood appearing on the drab fabric. She was not merely sewing. She was translating. She was taking the hard, masculine language of his experience of rock and soil and flow and giving it a form that was soft, tangible, and undeniable. She stitched the main channel of the San Gabriel, then the smaller, ghost-like tributaries that were now nothing but dry arroyos, their paths still visible to a man who knew how to look. When the network of blue thread was complete, it was Cole's turn. From a small leather pouch, he produced a handful of small, flat-headed brass tacks. They shone like dull gold in the lamplight. He took one, his thick, calloused fingers looking impossibly clumsy as they held the tiny object. But his touch was surprisingly precise. He pressed the tack into the burlap at a point just off the main channel. "Here," he said, his voice a low rumble. "This is where the spring used to be. Went dry 2 summers back." Eliza nodded, watching as he added another tack. "The bank collapsed here last year," he said, pressing the sharp point through the tough fabric. "Took a good 10 feet of pasture with it." He continued, adding a tack for every point of weakness, every leak, every scar the drought had inflicted upon the land. The brass tacks were his contribution to the map, a testament to loss and decay. The blue thread was the memory of what was. The brass tacks were the hard fact of what is. Together, they told the whole story. When he was finished, they stood back and looked at their creation. It was a strange and beautiful thing, a piece of folk art born of desperation. It was more real than any surveyor's map because it showed not just the lines on the land, but the life and the loss the land had endured. The next day, they took their map to the one man in town Eliza felt they could trust, Mr. Abernathy, the schoolmaster. He was a small, bird-like man with spectacles and a dusting of chalk on his coat sleeves, a quiet fixture who had outlasted 2 mayors and a sheriff. His domain was the small, clapboard schoolhouse, which also served as the repository for the town's official records. They found him grading papers at his desk, the afternoon sun slanting through the tall, wavy glass of the schoolhouse windows. Eliza made the introductions, her voice calm and respectful. Cole stood behind her, a silent, intimidating presence, holding the rolled-up burlap map in his hand. "Mr. Abernathy," Eliza began, "we have a concern about the water rights and the official property lines along the creek. We were hoping we might be allowed to see the town's land ledger." Abernathy looked up over his spectacles, his intelligent eyes moving from Eliza's earnest face to Cole's grim one. He was a man who heard all the town's whispers, and he had heard plenty about the North Silver Railroad. He didn't ask questions. He simply took a key from his waistcoat pocket, walked to a large, dusty cabinet, and unlocked it. He returned with a heavy, leather-bound book and laid it on a clear table. "The survey from 75 inches, he said, "the most recent one we have." Cole unrolled their burlap map and laid it gently beside the ledger. He opened the book to the correct page. There, in precise, faded ink, was the official map of the San Gabriel watershed. For a long moment, the 3 of them studied the 2 maps in silence, the only sound the ticking of a large clock on the wall. At first, they looked identical. The bend in the creek, the tributaries, the property line for Arroyo Blanco. But then Cole's finger came down on a specific point on the paper map. A small, inked X marked a boundary stone. He then traced a line from that stone to the corresponding point on the burlap map. There was a difference. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. "The southern marker," Cole said, his voice tight. "It's been moved." Abernathy leaned closer, his brow furrowed. He took a ruler from his desk and measured the distance on the official map. Then he laid the ruler on the burlap. "By how much?" the schoolmaster asked. "Half a hand's breadth," Cole answered. "Maybe a little more, but it's enough. It moves the legal boundary of my property north of the main creek channel. On this new survey, the creek isn't on my land. It's next to it." The quiet implication of his words filled the dusty schoolroom. Fraud. A slow, methodical theft not with a gun, but with a surveyor's chain and a moved rock. It was a lie written onto the land itself, designed to legally cut him off from the water that was his by right. A heavy silence fell. Just then, a small boy, one of Abernathy's younger students, appeared at the open door, holding a folded piece of paper. He was out of breath, his face flushed. "Mr. Thorn. The boy panted. A man from the saloon gave me a penny to bring this to you. Said it was important. Cole took the paper. His movements were stiff, deliberate. He unfolded it. It wasn't a letter. It was a printed notice, identical to the one tacked up in the saloon, but with a handwritten addendum at the bottom. Notice of preliminary hydraulic testing and flow measurement to commence at dawn, October 16th. Tomorrow. The word was a punch to the gut. Their quiet investigation was over. They were out of time. Cole looked at Eliza, and in her eyes, he saw the same grim understanding. Their window for preparation had just slammed shut. Jasper's not waiting for a consensus, Cole said, the words like stones in his mouth. Eliza turned to the schoolmaster. Mr. Abernathy, she said, her voice urgent but steady. You have a telescope for your astronomy lessons. Abernathy blinked, surprised by the change of subject. I do. A fine brass instrument, though the lens is a bit scratched. May we borrow it? She asked. Just until morning. He looked from her face to Cole's, and then to the damning evidence of the two maps laid out on the table. He nodded slowly. Knowledge, he said softly, is the only tool that cannot be taken from you. You'll find it in the closet. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, they stood on a low, scrub-covered hill that overlooked the northern bend of the creek, the spot where the red stake had been planted. Cole had set up the brass telescope on its rickety tripod, the lens aimed at the work site. Eliza held her cloak tightly around her, the precious burlap map wrapped safely within its folds. The air was cool and clear. Through the telescope's lens, the world came into sharp, magnified focus. They could see the railroad's work camp. A half-dozen men moved about a campfire, their figures dark against the flickering light. But it wasn't the men they were looking at. It was what was stacked nearby, in the deep shadows just beyond the firelight. There, Cole said, his voice low. He stepped back from the eyepiece, letting Eliza look. She leaned forward, her eye pressed to the cool brass. She saw them immediately. A neat pyramid of dark, metal drums. Even at this distance, she could see the faint stenciling on their sides, oil drums, and next to them, several large coils of what looked like rope. They weren't just there to build a dam. They were prepared for other contingencies. The fire starter Cole had found was not a lone threat. It was part of a well-stocked arsenal. A cold dread settled in Eliza's stomach. They mean to have it, one way or another. I'm going to take a closer look, Cole said. Stay here. He left her with the telescope and disappeared into the twilight, leading his horse. Eliza watched him go, a silent, determined figure melting into the landscape. For the next hour, she scanned the area around the camp, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. When Cole returned, he didn't ride up the hill. He appeared on foot, a ghost in the gloaming. He was holding something in his hand. He led her away from the crest of the hill, back into a small ravine where they could not be seen. Their foreman was just out here, he said, his voice tight with a cold fury. Checking the stakes. He knelt on the ground. In a patch of damp earth, shielded from the wind, was a single, perfect boot print. Cole pointed to it. Look. Eliza knelt beside him. The print was deep, the mark of a heavy man, but it was too small, unusual details that made her breath catch in her throat. Pressed into the mud at the edge of the heel was a small, perfect circle, an impression. The shape was unmistakable. It was the mark of a silver concho button, identical to the one she had seen on the vest of the man who had scurried away from her shop in the dead of night. And mixed into the mud clinging to the sole were tiny, dark specks that caught the last of the fading light with a faint, metallic glint. Iron filings, Cole said, his voice flat and hard. He looked at her, his eyes dark with certainty. The railroad foreman, Corrigan, he's the one who left the fire starter. He ran a finger along the edge of the boot print. A man who knows his trade. Mix iron filings with oil and turpentine, and you get a fire that burns hot enough to light up wet straw in a rainstorm. Eliza stared at the boot print, the final piece of the puzzle locking into place. It was all connected, the whispers, the threats, the moved marker, the silver buttons, the oil drums. It was a single, calculated campaign of intimidation and fraud, orchestrated by Jasper Crow and executed by his hired hand. She stood up, brushing the dirt from her skirt. The last light of day was gone, and the stars were beginning to appear in the vast, indifferent sky. Dawn was only a few hours away. She looked at Cole, at the grim set of his jaw, at the quiet, deadly purpose in his eyes. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overlaid with a fierce, burning resolve. She reached up and, with a few deft movements, unpinned her hair and tied it back in a tight, practical knot at the nape of her neck. It was the gesture of a woman preparing for a hard day's work. She looked toward the distant, flickering campfire of the railroad crew. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice a low, steady whisper in the dark. "We cut the wrong stitch and sew it back in the right place." The dawn arrived not as a gentle awakening, but as a sharp, cold incision on the horizon. A pale, gray light seeped over the eastern mesas, stripping the color from the landscape and revealing a world etched in shades of charcoal and bone. The air was thin and frigid, carrying the scent of dust and the faint, metallic tang of the coming day. Down at the creek, the sounds had already begun. The rhythmic thud of mallets driving stakes, the scrape of shovels on rock, the low, guttural curses of men working in the cold. The North Silver crew was starting its work. From their vantage point on the hill, Cole and Eliza had watched the camp stir to life through the schoolmaster's telescope. They had seen the foreman, Corrigan, directing his men with sharp, impatient gestures. They had a plan, a desperate one forged in the darkness of the previous night. It was a plan that relied on timing, courage, and the hope that a spark of decency still existed somewhere in the hearts of the men being paid to choke the valley. Just as the first sliver of the sun ignited the edge of the world, a lone buggy appeared on the road from town. It moved with an unhurried, proprietary air. Jasper Crow had come to personally oversee his investment. He brought his buggy to a halt a safe distance from the muddy creek bank, climbed down, and stood with his hands on his hips. Even from a distance, his posture radiated a smug satisfaction. He held a leather-bound ledger in one hand, the book of debts, the source of his power. He was not a king surveying his domain. He was a bookkeeper checking his accounts, and the entire valley was an entry he was about to mark as paid in full. Cole lowered the telescope. "It's time," he said, his voice a low growl. They had spent the last hours of the night not in rest, but in labor, using the ranch's only plow and their own raw strength. They had reopened an old, shallow irrigation ditch, a scar on the land that ran from a point just below the planned dam site directly toward Cole's main watering trough. It was a desperate gambit, a channel for a flood they had to create themselves. As they began to move down the back of the hill toward the ranch house, a new light flared in the periphery, a light that did not belong to the rising sun. It was a hungry, orange flicker that blossomed with unnatural speed against the dark, weathered wood of Cole's hay barn. Whoosh! The sound was a sudden, violent exhalation. The sound of dry hay and old wood catching fire all at once. A column of thick, oily black smoke began to boil into the pale morning sky. Corrigan hadn't waited. The distraction had begun. For a heartbeat, Cole froze, his face a mask of disbelief and raw fury. His entire winter's feed, his buffer against starvation, was going up in flames, but the paralysis lasted only that single, agonizing second. Then he moved. He was not a man, but an arrow released from a bowstring. He sprinted toward the fire, his long legs eating up the dry ground. There was no time for buckets, no time for thought, only for the instinct of a man fighting to save the last vestiges of his life. His eyes scanned the yard, and he saw it a heavy canvas tarp thrown over a stack of lumber, still dark and damp with the night's dew. He ripped it free, the weight of it staggering him for a moment. He half dragged, half carried it toward the barn, the roar of the fire growing louder, the heat a physical blow against his face. The flames were already licking up the side of the barn. a writhing, monstrous beast of orange and red. He swung the heavy, wet tarp in a wide arc, his muscles screaming with the effort, and slapped it against the base of the fire. The effect was immediate, but small. The canvas sizzled, and a great cloud of hissing steam erupted, momentarily beating back a section of the flames. It was like trying to smother a volcano with a handkerchief. Eliza was right behind him. The sight of the fire had sent a bolt of pure terror through her, but it was followed by a surge of cold, focused rage. She didn't scream. She didn't hesitate. She ran to the 2 full water barrels that stood by the porch, the ones filled with precious well water she had helped him haul just days before. With a strength born of adrenaline, she heaved against the first one, her shoulder digging into the rough wood. It was agonizingly heavy, but it began to move, rolling slowly, then picking up speed on the slight incline of the yard. She aimed it for the corner of the barn, where the fire was thickest. The barrel crashed against the wall, the wood splintering, and a wave of water exploded over the flames. There was a furious, boiling hiss, and for a moment, the fire retreated. But it was a momentary victory. The dry wood and hay were too far gone. The smoke was a living thing. It was thick and black and choked the air, clawing at their throats, making their eyes stream with tears. It tasted of ash and despair. Eliza stumbled back, coughing, her lungs burning. Through the swirling black clouds, she could see Cole, a demonic figure silhouetted against the flames, swinging the heavy tarp again and again. A relentless, desperate engine of resistance. He was a man possessed, fighting a battle he knew he was losing, but refusing to concede. Their desperate struggle had not gone unnoticed. At the creek, the work had stopped. The railroad crew stood watching the pillar of smoke, their tools idle in their hands. Jasper Crow remained by his buggy, a look of mild, calculated annoyance on his face, as if this were a slightly more dramatic turn of events than he had planned. Corrigan, the foreman, started walking toward the barn, his expression a mixture of satisfaction and impatience. He had a schedule to keep. He strode into the yard, his hand resting on the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. "Having some trouble. Thorne!" he called out, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Cole ignored him, his focus entirely on the fire. Corrigan's patience snapped. He drew his pistol, the click of the hammer being cocked unnaturally loud in the roar of the flames. "I said, leave it," he snarled. "It's a lost cause. Get back to your house before you get hurt." The threat was naked, ugly. The silver buttons on his vest gleamed in the firelight. That was the moment. The signal. Cole stopped. He let the heavy tarp fall to the ground. He turned slowly, his face smeared with soot, his eyes red from the smoke, but burning with a light more intense than the fire behind him. He looked not at Corrigan, but past him, toward the dam. His right hand, which had been hidden from Corrigan's view, came up. It held his own pistol, a worn, heavy Remington he had pulled from his belt as he ran from the hill. Corrigan's eyes widened in surprise. He started to raise his own weapon, but he was too slow. The crack of Cole's Remington was sharp and definitive. It was not aimed at Corrigan. It was aimed at the creek. The bullet screamed across the 100 yards separating them and struck a thick hemp rope, the main anchor line that held the new, hastily constructed dam wall against the pressure of the pooling water. The rope, already straining, snapped with a sound like a giant's whip crack. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, groaning sound, the wooden wall of the dam sagged, hesitated, and then collapsed inward. The water it had been holding back surged forward, a churning, muddy wave of unleashed power. It didn't follow its old, meandering path. It poured into the fresh, deep channel they had carved in the night, a straight, fast-moving torrent aimed directly at the heart of the ranch. The water swirled through the ditch, a brown, angry snake, and slammed into the long, empty drinking trough, filling it in a matter of seconds. Water, life, was pouring back onto the land. The chaos was absolute. At the creek, the railroad workers scrambled for higher ground as the water level dropped precipitously. Jasper Crow, who had taken a few steps forward to better observe the confrontation, let out a cry of alarm as the redirected flood surged closer than he'd expected. He tried to scramble back, but his polished city boots found no purchase in the soft, muddy soil of the creek bank. His feet went out from under him, and he landed flat on his back in a wide pool of slimy, brown mud. The precious ledger flew from his hand, landing with a wet slap in the middle of the new stream, its neat pages of debt and ruin instantly bleeding into an illegible, inky soup. Corrigan stood frozen, his pistol still half raised, his face a mask of stunned disbelief. His plan had literally washed away before his eyes, but Eliza was moving. While all eyes were on the flood and the fire, she ran toward the edge of the ranch yard, where a small, covered wagon had been left, ostensibly carrying supplies for the railroad crew. It was the wagon they had observed through the telescope, the one parked near the oil drums. With a surge of strength, she ripped back the canvas flap. Inside, just as they had suspected, was another of the dark metal drums. She grabbed it, heaving it with all her might. It toppled from the wagon and crashed to the ground, rolling into the open. And there, stenciled in stark white letters for all to see, were the words, "Property of the North Silver Railroad Co." She pointed to the drum, then to the fire. Her voice, though raw from the smoke, rang out with the clarity of a bell. "This is their work," she cried. "They set the fire. Here is their proof." The railroad workers, who had been watching with a kind of detached curiosity, now looked at each other with uncertainty. They were hired to build a dam, not to be part of an arson plot. A few of them began to back away slowly, their faces grim. This was not what they had signed up for. From the direction of the town, a new sound began to build, a frantic, rhythmic clang. The church bell. Mr. Abernathy, the schoolmaster, was holding up his end of the bargain. He was calling the town to witness what was happening. The sound was a summons, a cry for justice that rolled across the plains. The roof of the barn, its main supports burned through, began to groan and sag. A shower of hot, glowing embers rained down around them. Cole reacted without thinking. He lunged toward Eliza, pulling her into him, turning his back to the collapsing structure and shielding her body with his own. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her head against his chest as hot ash and smoldering debris fell around them. The world was a maelstrom of noise, the roar of the fire, the rush of the water, the clang of the distant bell, the shouts of confused men. But in that small circle of protection, there was a strange, profound silence. Eliza could feel the solid, steady beat of his heart against her cheek. She could feel the strength in the arms that held her, a strength that was fierce and protective and utterly real. The smoke still burned her lungs. The heat still scorched the air, but she felt safe. As the shower of embers subsided, he loosened his hold but did not let her go. He was still standing over her, a shield against the chaos, in the swirling smoke and falling ash. Their hands found each other. It wasn't a conscious thought, not a deliberate act. It was an instinct, as natural and necessary as drawing breath. Her smaller, soot-stained fingers found his, and his closed around them. A promise of solidarity in the heart of the storm. They didn't look at each other. They looked out at the ruin and the renewal they had wrought together. Their hands clasped, a single, unbroken anchor in a world that had just been torn apart and remade. The church in Redemption was not a place of grandeur. It was a simple, stark building of pine and faith, smelling of old hymnals and beeswax. But on that day, with the smoke from Cole Thorne's barn still a hazy smudge on the western horizon, it became something else. It became a courtroom. The townspeople, drawn by the frantic ringing of the bell and the column of smoke, had gathered, their faces a mixture of fear, curiosity, and a grim, simmering anger. They filled the rough-hewn pews, their work-worn hands resting on their knees, their eyes fixed on the front of the church. Reverend Michael stood where he normally delivered his sermons. He was a tall, lean man whose face had been carved by the same harsh elements as his parishioners. He was both their spiritual guide and, by virtue of being the most literate and level-headed man in town, their de facto justice of the peace. He had pushed 2 long tables together before the altar, creating a makeshift bench. On one side stood Jasper Crow, his fine suit now stained with mud, his face a mask of composed indignation. Beside him was the foreman, Corrigan, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression sullen and defiant. On the other side stood Cole Thorne and Eliza Hart. They were covered in soot and smelled of smoke. Cole's knuckles were wrapped in a dirty, blood-stained linen bandage. Eliza's hair, which she had tied back so practically, was now wild with loose strands, her face smudged with ash. They did not look like victors. They looked like survivors. "We are here," Reverend Michael began, his voice echoing in the sudden, absolute silence of the church. "Not to cast stones, but to find the truth. This is a house of God. But today it must also be a house of facts. Mr. Crow, you and the North Silver Railroad have made a claim on the water of the San Gabriel. Mr. Thorne has lodged a complaint against this claim. We will hear both sides." He looked at Cole. "Mr. Thorne, you may begin." Cole did not speak. He looked at Eliza. It was her cue. This was her part of the plan. With a quiet dignity that seemed unshaken by the morning's chaos, Eliza stepped forward. She carried the rolled-up burlap map. She walked to the long table and, with a gentle movement, unrolled it for all to see. A collective murmur went through the pews. The townspeople leaned forward, their eyes drawn to the strange, compelling object. It was a map unlike any they had ever seen. The winding blue thread, the ghost-like stitches of the dry tributaries, the stark brass tacks marking every point of failure and loss. It was not just a map of a creek. It was a portrait of their shared struggle, of their collective thirst. They understood it instantly, in a way they never could have understood a surveyor's precise, sterile chart. They saw their own ranches, their own dry fields, their own dying hopes stitched into that humble piece of fabric. The silence returned, deeper this time, thick with a shared understanding. Then it was Cole's turn. He walked back out of the church and returned a moment later, carrying the red surveyor's stake in one hand. He placed it on the table with a solid, definitive thud. The red-painted tip seemed to glow in the dim light of the church. "This was driven into the creek bed on my land," he said, his voice low and steady. "In the middle of the night." He went out again. This time, he returned with a younger man, one of the railroad workers who had stood by and watched the fire. Between them, they carried the heavy, stinking oil drum Eliza had pulled from the wagon. They set it on the floor in front of the table. The stenciled words, "Property of the North Silver Railroad Commit," facing the crowd. "And this," Cole said, his voice resonating with a cold, hard anger, "is what they were going to use to burn me out when moving the boundary markers wasn't enough." The evidence lay before them, the map of their shared lifeblood, the stake that marked its theft, and the drum that held the means of its violent enforcement. Jasper Crow stepped forward, his composure finally beginning to crack. He waved a dismissive hand at the objects on the table. "This is preposterous. It's theatrics, Reverend. I am a businessman, not an outlaw. The railroad is the agent of progress, and progress requires resources. We made a fair offer for the water rights. By moving boundary stones." Cole's voice cut through Jasper's speech like an axe through dead wood. "A simple surveying error, I assure you, which would have been corrected in due course." Jasper snapped back, his eyes flashing. "And as for this other melodrama, we are in the middle of a drought. A fire can start from a single spark in a patch of dry grass. To suggest that I would be party to such a thing is an insult." He drew himself up, trying to reclaim his authority. "This is simply business. Reverend, hard business. Perhaps. For hard times. Mr. Thorne owes the bank a significant sum. His land is the collateral. I was and am acting to protect my investment and to bring prosperity to this entire valley." Reverend Michael listened patiently, his gaze unwavering. He let the banker's words hang in the air, let the people in the pews absorb their meaning. He looked at the hard faces of the ranchers, at the worried expressions of the town's merchants. Then he turned his eyes, filled with a quiet, solemn weight, to the two figures standing opposite the banker. He did not look at Cole. He looked at Eliza. His question was soft, almost gentle, but it cut through the room with the sharpness of a razor. "Miss Hart," he asked, "has anyone been threatened by fire?" Every eye in the church swung to her. They saw the soot on her face, the weariness in her posture, but they also saw the clear, unwavering strength in her gaze as she lifted her head. She looked past the reverend, past the altar, and directly at Jasper Crow. Her voice was not loud, but it was as clear and true as the bell that had summoned them all here. "Yes," she said. The word, a single, simple syllable, landed with the force of a hammer blow. It was not an accusation shouted in anger. It was a fact stated in sorrow. And it was devastating. Before Jasper could formulate a response, another voice spoke up, a voice from the back of the church. It was the young railroad worker who had helped Cole carry in the oil drum. He was little more than a boy, with a face full of fear and a conscience that was clearly at war with his need for a wage. "It was Corrigan," the boy said, his voice cracking. He pointed a trembling finger at the foreman. He offered me an extra $1 to light it. He said it was just to scare him, to make him sign the papers." The boy's eyes were wide, pleading for understanding. "I didn't do it, I swear to God. I didn't, but he gave the orders." He swallowed hard. "He was the one with the silver buttons." A wave of murmurs swept through the church. Several people turned to stare at Corrigan's vest, at the tarnished silver conchos that now seemed to glint like the eyes of a snake. The foreman's face went pale. He looked to Jasper for help, but the banker stood frozen. His mask of righteous indignation shattered, leaving only the ugly face of his greed exposed. At that moment, the morning sun, having finally climbed above the plains, struck the church's single stained glass window. It was a simple window, depicting a shepherd guiding his flock, a gift from a congregation long since gone. The light streamed through the colored glass, the deep blues, the blood reds, the hopeful golds, and cut a brilliant, multi-hued shaft through the dusty air of the church. The tiny motes of dust, which had been agitated by the crowd, were illuminated, dancing and swirling in the beam of colored light like a host of tiny, silent angels. The light fell across the makeshift court, across the faces of the accusers and the accused, across the burlap map and the red-tipped stake. It was as if a higher judgment were being rendered, a silent, colorful benediction on the search for truth. Reverend Michael stood in that shaft of light, and when he spoke, his voice carried a new weight, the weight of a verdict. "This is not a formal court of law," he said, his voice resonating through the silent church. "We have no marshal to enforce a sentence, but we are a community, bound by God and by common decency. The evidence before us is plain to see." He looked directly at Jasper Crow. "The North Silver Railroad's attempt to construct a dam on the San Gabriel Creek is hereby suspended, indefinitely. A full investigation into the fraudulent altering of territorial survey markers will be requested from the county seat." He then pointed a stern finger at the oil drum. "Furthermore, as provisional recompense for the deliberate and malicious destruction of private property, the railroad will be fined a sum sufficient to purchase and deliver winter feed for Mr. Thorne's entire herd, and to provide the lumber and labor to rebuild his barn." A collective sigh of approval, of released tension, went through the pews. It was a practical justice, a frontier justice, rooted not in prisons and legalese, but in the simple, powerful act of making a man whole again. Jasper Crow stared at the reverend, his face a thunderous mask of fury. He had been beaten, not by lawyers or by lawmen, but by a stubborn rancher, a seamstress, and the simple decency of his neighbors. He opened his mouth to protest, to argue, but he saw the faces in the crowd, the hard, unyielding set of their jaws. He saw that his currency of intimidation, of paper, of debt was worthless here. Without another word, he spun on his heel. He snatched his hat from the table, crushing the brim in his fist. He strode down the central aisle, his polished boots striking the wooden floorboards with a series of sharp, angry cracks that echoed in the silent church. Each footstep was a declaration of his rage and his defeat. He shoved the church doors open and disappeared into the harsh, unforgiving sunlight. A man who had tried to own the water and had been consumed by the drought of his own soul. That night, the rain came. It did not come with the violence of a storm, with thunder that cracked the sky or lightning that tore at the horizon. It came as a whisper, a promise fulfilled. A fine, soft rain that began as a tentative tapping on the tin roof of Cole's small house, and slowly, steadily, grew into a constant, rhythmic drumming. It was a sound of cleansing, a sound of life. Each drop that struck the roof was a tiny percussionist, playing a lullaby for a parched and wounded land. Inside, the world had shrunk to the warm, golden circle of light cast by a single kerosene lamp. The day's chaos, the smoke and the fury, felt a world away. They had done what they could to salvage what was left of the barn, dousing the last of the embers and securing the cattle in a makeshift pen. Now, exhaustion had settled deep into their bones, a heavy, leaden thing. Eliza sat in the cabin's only comfortable chair, a worn horsehair armchair that had been Martha's. Cole had insisted she take it, in her hands. She held his heavy shooting jacket, the one she had mended once before. The morning's fight had torn it anew. A long, jagged rip near the left breast, right over the heart. A silver thimble glinted on her finger as she worked, her needle weaving a neat, strong seam, pulling the torn edges of the dark wool together. She worked with a quiet, focused grace, her movements economical and precise. Each stitch was a tiny act of restoration, a small defiance against the day's destruction. Cole sat at the small wooden table, watching her. He was cleaning his Remington, but his hands were slow, his attention elsewhere. He watched the way the lamplight caught the soft curve of her cheek and the deep, serious concentration in her eyes. He watched her fingers, so deft and sure, as they brought order to the chaos of the torn fabric. He had not had a woman sitting in that chair, mending his clothes, since Martha. The sight of it, the simple, profound domesticity of it, sent a strange, unfamiliar ache through his chest. It was a feeling he had long since buried, a ghost he had not allowed himself to acknowledge. Outside, the rain fell harder, a steady, soothing drumbeat on the roof. They could hear the soft, contented breathing of the cattle from the pen just beyond the cabin wall, a warm, living sound that spoke of safety and shelter. When she finished the jacket, she folded it neatly and set it aside. The silence in the small room was comfortable, filled not with emptiness, but with the shared weight of their exhaustion and the music of the rain. Cole rose from the table and moved to the small cast-iron stove that dominated one corner of the room. He lifted the lid on a heavy pot that had been simmering there for hours. The rich, earthy smell of bean and salt pork stew filled the cabin. He ladled the thick stew into 2 chipped enamel bowls. He set them on the table with 2 wooden spoons and a half loaf of dark bread. They ate in silence. The only sounds, the soft scrape of their spoons against the bowls and the constant, gentle drumming of the rain. The food was simple, but it was hot and nourishing, a balm to their weary bodies. Halfway through the meal, as they both reached for the bread at the same time, their spoons brushed against each other in one of the bowls, a tiny, insignificant clink of wood on wood. But in the quiet intimacy of the cabin, the sound was as loud as a shout. They both froze for a second, their eyes meeting over the table. A current, as real and potent as a lightning strike, passed between them. It was a jolt of awareness, a sudden, sharp recognition of the profound change that had occurred between them. They were no longer just a rancher and a seamstress. They were allies, partners, 2 solitary people who had found an anchor in each other in the midst of a storm. They looked away just as quickly, a faint blush rising on Eliza's cheeks, a muscle tightening in Cole's jaw. They finished their meal in a new kind of silence, one that was no longer just comfortable, but charged with a fragile, unspoken tenderness. After they had eaten, Cole took the bowls to the washing-up basin. Eliza remained at the table, her hands wrapped around a warm tin cup of coffee he had poured for her. She looked around the small, spare cabin. It was a man's space, clean but unadorned. There were no curtains on the single window, no pictures on the walls, except for one. Over the mantelpiece of the cold, unused fireplace, there was a small, oval-framed photograph of a woman with a kind, gentle face and eyes that held a hint of laughter. Martha. Cole returned to the table and sat down, his own cup of coffee held loosely in his hands. He followed her gaze to the photograph. "That was Martha," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual rough edges. "She was beautiful," Eliza said softly. He nodded, his eyes fixed on the picture, but seeing something far beyond it. "She loved this place, said the silence was so loud you could hear the grass grow." He took a slow sip of his coffee. "This room, this was our room, the one in the back." He gestured with his head toward a closed door. "That was hers, her sewing room. After she died, I closed the door. I haven't been in it since." He looked down at his hands, at the scarred, calloused knuckles. "I thought if I didn't go in, if I just kept working, kept my head down, I could keep her safe in there, keep the memory of her safe. But all I did was trap a ghost, and myself along with it." It was a confession, a bearing of a soul he had kept locked away for 2 long years. He was telling her the source of his coldness, the reason for the stone he carried in his gut. Eliza listened, her heart aching for him, for the depth of his lonely grief. She did not offer empty words of comfort. She knew they would be meaningless. Instead, she offered him a piece of her own story, a gift of understanding. "I came to redemption from a town called Harmony," she began, her voice a low murmur. "And before that, a place called Providence. I've lived in 3 towns in the last 5 years." She looked into her coffee cup, as if seeing her past reflected in its dark surface. "In Providence, I was to be married to a banker's son a week before the wedding. He called it off, said his father didn't approve. The truth was, he'd found a bride with a larger dowry. The town, they looked at me with pity. Then the whispers started. They wondered what was wrong with me, what I had done to drive him away." She took a shaky breath. "In Harmony, I opened a small shop, much like this one. I worked hard. I kept to myself. But a woman alone is a target for gossip, for assumptions. I learned to stand up straight when people whispered. I learned to meet their eyes. And I learned that the only person you can truly rely on is yourself." She finally looked up, her moss-green eyes meeting his. "I came to redemption because I was tired of running. I decided that this would be the place where I would not just stand tall, but where I would plant my feet." He heard what she was telling him, that she, too, knew what it was to be alone, to be judged, to have to fight for her place in the world. They were both survivors, scarred in different ways by the lives they had led. The cabin was warm from the stove, the air thick with their shared confessions. The rain still fell, a constant, gentle washing of the world outside. Eliza looked at him, at the raw vulnerability in his eyes, at the way the lamplight carved lines of exhaustion and old sorrow onto his face. She thought of the empty room, of the ghost he had lived with for so long. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Are you afraid of losing someone again?" He met her gaze without hesitation. The answer was torn from the deepest, most guarded part of his soul. "Yes," he said. The word was a raw wound, an admission of the terror that had kept him locked in his solitude. The single word hung in the air between them, a fragile, precious truth. Eliza felt her own fear, her fear of being hurt again, of trusting and being abandoned. But looking at him, she knew this was different. This was real. She stood up from the table. She walked around it until she stood before him. She held out her hand. Her voice was soft, but the question was as momentous as any she had ever asked. "Will you hold my hand again?" He looked from her outstretched hand to her face, at the hope and the fear that mingled in her eyes. He stood up slowly. He did not speak. He simply reached out and took her hand in his. Yes, his hand was warm and strong, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. A familiar, solid anchor. He led her not to the door, but to the porch. He pushed the cabin door open, and the cool, damp, rain-scented air washed over them. They stood together on the low porch, under the slight protection of the overhanging roof, and watched the rain fall. It came down in silvery sheets, blurring the edges of the world, turning the darkness into a soft, shimmering curtain of gray. The parched ground was drinking it in, the thirsty earth finally receiving its sacrament. They stood there for a long time, hand in hand, listening to the music of the rain on the roof and the soft gurgle of the water running off the eaves. The world was washed clean, and in the quiet of the rainy night, it felt as if they were the only two people left in it. He turned to her then. He raised his free hand and gently, so gently, brushed a stray, rain-dampened strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was hesitant, reverent. She leaned into it, her eyes fluttering closed for a second. The kiss, when it came, was as soft and as gentle as the rain that fell around them. It was not a kiss of fire or passion. It was a kiss of profound gratitude, of quiet recognition. It was slow and sure, a meeting of two lonely, weary souls who had found an unexpected harbor in each other. It was not a kiss that took, but a kiss that gave of comfort, of solace, of a fragile, budding hope. It was not a fiery explosion, but the slow, steady warmth of an ember taking hold, promising a fire to keep out the cold. They stood there for a long time, their lips barely touching, while the rain washed the world clean. Inside the cabin, the embers in the stove glowed a deep, steady red, a promise of warmth that would last through the night. Outside, in the soft, healing rain, the long, dark night of Arroyo Blanco suddenly felt a little less long. Defeat does not sit well with men like Corrigan. Humiliation festers, turning to a poison that demands an outlet. The rain that had been a blessing to the valley was, to the railroad foreman, a personal insult. It had softened the ground, swelled the creek, and delayed his work. But it had not extinguished the fire in his gut. Jasper Crow had paid for a result, and Corrigan was a man who delivered. The night was moonless, the clouds of the recent rain now a thick, suffocating blanket that swallowed the starlight. The only light came from the churning, angry water of the San Gabriel as it rushed through the narrow gorge spanned by the old stone bridge. The bridge was little more than a natural choke point, a place where massive, water-smoothed boulders on either side narrowed the creek's path, allowing for a crude but effective crossing. It was the perfect place to build a dam, a place to strangle the valley, and it was the perfect place for an ambush. Cole was not alone. He lay flat on a rocky ledge overlooking the bridge, the cold stone seeping through his jacket. To his left lay Silas, a grizzled old rancher whose property downstream had been turning to dust for 2 seasons. To his right was a young homesteader named Ben, his face tight with a fear that was overshadowed only by his determination to protect his family's small plot of land. They were 3 men, armed with rifles and a shared, silent resolve. They had been watching the bridge since nightfall, a grim, self-appointed vigil. Cole had known the fight was not over. The public shaming in the church would only make their enemies more desperate, more dangerous. They would not try to build their dam in broad daylight again. They would come like thieves in the night. A faint sound reached them over the roar of the water, the clink of a horseshoe on stone. Cole pressed himself lower, his eyes straining in the darkness. Figures emerged from the gloom on the far side of the creek, 4 of them, leading their horses. He recognized Corrigan's broad, bullish frame immediately. The other 3 were hard-faced men, the kind of rootless drifters who would do anything for a handful of silver. They were carrying shovels, mallets, and heavy coils of rope. They had come to finish the job. As Corrigan's men began to unload their equipment, a new light appeared. It was not the sudden flare of a match, but a soft, steady glow that bloomed on the near side of the creek, downstream from the bridge. A storm lantern, its wick turned up high, was being lifted. A moment later, a second lantern flared to life beside it. In the twin circles of golden light stood Eliza Hart and Mr. Abernathy. The schoolmaster held his lantern high, his face pale but resolute. Eliza stood beside him, her expression calm and focused. They were not hiding. They were a deliberate, undeniable presence. They were witnesses. Their light turned the dark gorge into a stage, illuminating the conspirators and stripping them of the anonymity of the night. Corrigan spun around, his hand immediately going to the pistol at his hip. "What the hell is this?" he roared, his voice nearly lost in the noise of the rushing water. "This is a public waterway. Mr. Corrigan," Abernathy called out, his voice surprisingly firm. "You have no legal right to obstruct it." One of Corrigan's men, spooked by the sudden appearance of the lights, panicked. He raised his rifle and fired a wild shot. The bullet didn't hit anyone. It screamed off the face of a boulder near Cole's head, showering him with chips of stone and filling the air with a sharp smell of cordite. The night exploded into chaos. Cole's rifle was already at his shoulder. He didn't fire at the men. He fired at the rock just above their heads. The shot was a warning, a deafening crack that echoed through the gorge. Silas and Ben opened fire a second later, their shots aimed not to kill, but to terrify, to drive the men back from the water's edge. Bullets whined through the air, ricocheting off the stones with angry, high-pitched shrieks. A horse, tethered too close to the action, screamed in terror, its eyes rolling white in the lantern light. It reared back, snapping its reins, and galloped off into the darkness. Corrigan and his men scrambled for cover behind the large boulders, firing blindly into the night. Gunpowder flashed in the darkness, momentary, brilliant blossoms of light that illuminated the scene in stark, frozen tableaus, a man's face contorted in a snarl, the glint of a gun barrel, the churning, black water of the creek. Amid the chaos, Eliza was moving. No one was paying attention to her or the schoolmaster. All eyes were on the flashes of rifle fire from the ridge. She handed her lantern to Abernathy and picked up a coiled rope that lay at her feet. They had found it in Cole's ruined barn, a length of thick hemp he used for pulling calves from the mud. Tied to one end was a heavy iron grappling hook. She began to swing it, a slow, steady circle at first, then faster and faster, the hook a dark blur in the lantern light. Her target was not a man. It was one of the pack horses the crew had brought with them. Unlike the others, this one was not laden with tools. It carried two of the familiar, dark metal drums of oil, lashed securely to a heavy wooden pack saddle. It stood, trembling with fear. Just at the edge of the light, Eliza let the rope fly. It sailed through the air in a perfect arc, the grappling hook catching firmly on the wooden frame of the pack saddle. The horse, already terrified, bolted. It lunged away from the light, but the rope held. Eliza dug her heels into the soft earth, her body straining against the animal's panicked strength. "Now, Mr. Abernathy," she cried. The schoolmaster, who had tied the other end of the rope to the base of a sturdy tree, threw his weight against it, pulling the line taut. The rope acted as a pivot. The horse, fighting against the sudden, unyielding pressure, stumbled sideways, its hooves scrabbling for purchase on the muddy, sloping bank of the creek. The pack saddle, heavy and unbalanced, shifted. For a heart-stopping moment, the horse teetered on the brink. Then, with a cry of animal terror, it lost its footing. It slid down the muddy bank, but the saddle, snagged by the rope, was ripped from its back. The two oil drums tumbled free, crashing down into the churning black water of the San Gabriel. There was a loud splash, and the drums disappeared into the current. A dark, iridescent slick of oil spread on the surface for a moment, then was torn apart and washed away by the powerful flow of the rain-swollen creek. The threat of fire was gone, drowned in the very water they had come to steal. The sight of his plan literally washing away seemed to break something in Corrigan. He let out a roar of pure, animalistic rage. He stopped firing at the ridge and charged out from behind his cover, his pistol raised, aimed directly at Eliza. He never made it. Cole had been watching, waiting for his moment. When Corrigan exposed himself, Cole launched himself from the ledge. He didn't climb down. He half slid, half fell down the steep, rocky incline, his boots finding purchase where there was none. He hit the ground running and slammed into Corrigan with the force of a runaway train. The two men crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs. Corrigan's pistol flew from his grasp, skittering across the wet stones. They rolled over and over. Two beasts locked in a primal struggle. Cole was wiry and strong, but Corrigan was heavier, his rage giving him a brutal strength. He managed to get on top, his big hands closing around Cole's throat. Cole's vision began to swim. Black spots danced before his eyes. He couldn't breathe. He clawed at Corrigan's hands, but the foreman's grip was like iron. Desperate, Cole bucked his hips, throwing Corrigan off balance for just a second. It was enough. He brought his knee up hard into the foreman's side. Corrigan grunted, the air driven from his lungs, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. In that instant, Cole twisted, rolling out from under him. As he did, his hand snagged on Corrigan's vest. There was a sound of tearing fabric, a sharp pop. Something small and metallic flew through the air, struck a rock, and rolled into the shadows at the edge of the gorge, near a thick cluster of boulders on the far side of the bridge. A single silver button. At that moment, a new light appeared on the road from town, a moving, flickering line of torches. The gunshots had been heard. The town was coming. Corrigan's remaining men, seeing the approaching lights and realizing the fight was lost, scrambled for their remaining horses and fled into the night. Corrigan, seeing he was alone, got to his feet and made a dash for the darkness. But Cole was faster. He tackled him again, this time bringing him down for good. He pinned the foreman to the ground, his forearm pressed hard against his throat. The townspeople arrived, their faces grim in the flickering torchlight. They were led by Reverend Michael. "What is happening here?" the Reverend demanded, his voice a stern command. "Mister." Abernathy pointed a trembling finger at the struggling men on the ground. "They came back! They tried to dam the creek again!" A woman in the crowd let out a small cry and pointed. "Look!" Her finger was not aimed at Cole and Corrigan. It was aimed at the shadows by the far side of the bridge. The torchlight had caught a glint of silver on the ground. The lost button. As the crowd moved closer, their lights pooling together, the beam of illumination spread. It moved past the button, into the dark space between two massive boulders, and there, cowering in the darkness, was Jasper Crow. He was caught, a rat in a trap, his face a ghastly, pale mask of terror in the sudden light. He had been hiding, waiting to watch his plan come to fruition from a safe distance. But what froze the crowd, what made them all gasp in a single, unified breath of horrified understanding, was what he was holding in his hands. It was a bundle of oil-soaked rags, and a tinderbox, its lid open, a flint and steel ready to be struck, the final, irrefutable proof of his intent. Cole got to his feet, pulling a winded and defeated Corrigan up with him. He looked across the water at the banker, at the damning evidence in his hands, at the utter ruin of his carefully constructed lies. Cole's voice was quiet, but it carried over the roar of the water, a voice of cold, hard judgment. "It wasn't the drought," he said, for all the town to hear. "It was greed." No one spoke. The truth of it settled over them, as cold and as heavy as the stone beneath their feet. Silas, the old rancher, stepped forward. He uncoiled the lariat from his saddle. He didn't say a word. He walked across the bridge, his footsteps heavy and deliberate, and bound a stunned and silent Jasper Crow's hands behind his back. Reverend Michael walked to the banker. From his coat, he produced a small, folded document and a piece of sealing wax. In the flickering torchlight, he dripped a pool of hot red wax onto the paper and pressed his signet ring into it. He handed the makeshift warrant to Silas. "He is to be held in the blacksmith shop until the marshal can be summoned from the county seat," the Reverend declared, his voice tolling with the finality of a funeral bell. As they led Jasper and Corrigan away, the crowd began to disperse, their low, angry murmurs fading into the night. Cole and Eliza were left standing by the water's edge with Mr. Abernathy. The immediate danger was over, but the air was still thick with the aftermath of violence. Cole looked down at the water. The torches of the departing townsfolk cast shimmering, dancing reflections on its surface. The rain had washed the creek clean. The current, now unobstructed, was finding its old, familiar path, carving its way through the silt and debris. In the flickering light, the water sparkled. It was as if the darkness on the surface had been broken, and the true, ancient heart of the creek was being revealed again, a living, glittering artery of hope, finally allowed to run free. The sun that rose over redemption in the weeks that followed was the same relentless, white-hot star, but it no longer felt like an enemy. The rain had washed the dust from the air, and the land, though still scarred and thirsty, seemed to be breathing again. The change was not just in the weather, it was in the very soul of the town. The fear that had been a constant, low hum beneath the surface had been replaced by a quiet, resilient pride. The North Silver Railroad did not disappear. Progress, Cole knew, was a river that could not be dammed forever, but its course could be altered. A delegation of sober-faced men in city suits arrived on the stagecoach, their expressions a careful mixture of apology and pragmatism. They met not with Jasper Crow, but with Reverend Michael, Cole, and a small council of ranchers in the same church that had served as a courtroom. There were no threats this time, no talk of concessions. The railroad, facing a county investigation and the threat of having its territorial grants revoked, was in a mood to cooperate. A new agreement was drafted by Mr. Abernathy, his penmanship as precise and clear as his moral compass. The railroad would not obstruct the San Gabriel. Instead, using its own men and materials, it would construct a series of long, stone-lined drinking troughs at 3 points along the creek, ensuring that any water diverted for their engines was shared equally with the livestock of the valley. It was a victory born not of violence, but of community resolve. Jasper Crow's departure was a quiet, ignominious affair. He did not leave in a rage, but with the silent, hurried efficiency of a man trying to outrun his own disgrace. The bank was sold to a consortium from the county seat. His buggy was gone before dawn one Tuesday, leaving behind nothing but a few unpaid bills at the mercantile and a palpable sense of relief. The county marshal, when he finally arrived, found his primary suspects had already fled. He took a long statement from Cole, another from Eliza, and declared the case an unfortunate but clear-cut matter of corporate malfeasance. The fraudulent drought fee was struck from the bank's ledgers, and a notice was posted on the church door declaring Cole Thorne's debt officially, and finally, paid in full. He had kept the land. Life in redemption settled into a new rhythm. In Eliza's shop, a transformation took place. The front of the store remained her domain of fabric and thread, a place of practical creation. But the dusty back room, once a forgotten repository of dog-eared books, began to change. With the help of Mr. Abernathy, she cleaned and organized, building new shelves from salvaged lumber. It became the Redemption Lending Library, a small but fiercely proud institution. Children, their faces scrubbed clean after school, would come in, their voices hushed with a new reverence, and leave with worlds of adventure tucked under their arms. And on the wall, in the place of honor above the highest bookshelf, hung the burlap map. Its blue thread seemed even more vibrant now, a defiant declaration of life against the earthy tones of the fabric. The brass tacks no longer seemed like markers of loss, but like medals of honor, commemorating every battle fought and won against the drought. It was her own private flag, a testament to a quiet, stitched-together victory. Cole, too, was rebuilding. The townspeople, in a silent, coordinated act of frontier solidarity, had helped him clear the wreckage of the burned barn. The railroad, true to the Reverend's verdict, had delivered a wagon load of fresh lumber and hay. But before he began to raise the new frame, he undertook a different kind of construction. He took a solid, weathered plank of cottonwood and, With the same patient determination he used to mend a fence, he carved a series of letters into its surface. The work was slow, his knife cutting deep into the pale wood. When he was finished, he carried the sign down to the bank of the newly cleared creek. He dug a deep hole and set the post, tamping the damp earth around it until it stood firm and true. The sign was simple, its message absolute. It read, "This water belongs to the community." The days grew warmer, the sun stronger. But now the heat was a promise of growth, not a threat of extinction. The noon church bell, which had once been a summons to judgment, was now just a familiar, reassuring marker of another peaceful day passing. Down by the creek, the new stone troughs were always full. Young calves, born in the wake of the rain, drank their fill, their mothers watching with calm, liquid eyes. The land was healing. One hot afternoon, Cole walked from his ranch into town. He moved with the same steady, unhurried pace, but the weight he carried on his shoulders seemed lighter. He found Eliza sitting on the small bench outside her shop, enjoying the last of the afternoon sun. She looked up as he approached, a soft, welcoming smile touching her lips. He didn't speak at first. He simply stood before her and held out his hand. Lying on his open, calloused palm was a neatly folded square of white cotton. It was the handkerchief she had returned to him, the one he had dropped on that first day. It was clean, pressed, but it was different now. In one corner, stitched with a dark blue thread that matched the creek on her map, were two small, slightly uneven words. The stitches were not the work of a skilled seamstress. They were rough, honest, and powerful. They read, "Brave hands." She took the handkerchief, her fingers brushing against his. She ran her thumb over the rough embroidery, a lump forming in her throat. It was the most eloquent poem she had ever read. It was a recognition of her courage, of her part in the fight. It was his way of saying everything he could not put into spoken words. She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "I'm still afraid sometimes," she confessed, her voice a soft murmur, "of the wind, of the quiet, of what the next season might bring." She placed her free hand on top of his, her fingers lacing through his. "But with you, the fear has a place to breathe. It doesn't own me anymore." He looked down at their joined hands, then back at her face. His own voice was a low rumble, the words simple, solid, and as true as the ground beneath their feet. "We'll go slow," he said. "We'll do it right. We'll do it together." It was not a promise of a life without hardship. It was not a fairy tale ending. It was something better. It was a vow of partnership, a commitment to the shared, steady labor of building a life. He kept her hand in his, and they began to walk. They left the dusty street of the town behind and walked out along the bank of the creek, following the path of the water. The sun was hot on their backs, and the light was sharp and clear. They didn't speak. There was no need for words. They walked in a comfortable, shared silence, their steps falling into a natural rhythm. The water gurgled beside them, a constant, soothing music. They walked for a long time, their clasped hands a silent testament to the bond they had forged in fire and in faith. The harsh sun cast their shadows on the ground before them, but the two distinct shapes had merged, flowing into a single, long, unbroken line. Far ahead of them, where the creek disappeared toward the horizon, a faint, almost imperceptible line of green was beginning to appear. The new grass, nurtured by the rain and the sun, was pushing its way up through the cracked, thirsty earth. It was not a lush meadow. Not yet. It was just a promise. A fragile, verdant ribbon unfurling across the plains. It was a new season. A beginning. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you'd like to help this story reach more listeners, please consider hitting the hype button to show your support.